So the title of today's TEDx talk is about the next enlightenment. But I'm actually going to talk about a different period in Scotland's history, a world-changing period in our history in which Scotland played a key role. And that period is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution really changed a great deal about the way that we see the world and the way that we experience the world. And for me, the centerpiece of the Industrial Revolution is the industrial system of production. And that's a system that's endured for, well, at least a couple of hundred years. But it's showing signs that perhaps it won't endure for very much longer, which is why I'm going to ask the question in this talk, are we on the verge of a new industrial revolution? So, first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to talk through that industrial system of production using the example of producing a washing machine. Then we're going to look at how things are perhaps changing. So, if we're designing a washing machine, obviously we start off with a designer. The designer works out the specifications of the machine, how it's going to operate, and then the raw materials are sourced. And today, more so than ever before, those materials can come from all corners of the world. So they get shipped from all corners of the world to an assembly point. And of course, during the Industrial Revolution, that assembly point was places like Manchester, where there was a lot of low-wage labour putting together all sorts of products. But these days, in the search for low-wage labour, we go to places like China. So much of our stuff is assembled in countries like that, simply for those cost reasons. Now, if this washing machine is going to be purchased and used in the UK, then obviously it has to be transported back here. So it'll go onto a ship, and it will travel all its way back here to the UK, perhaps to a place like Southampton Port. It'll be unloaded, it'll be taken to the retailer, and we'll go in there and we'll buy our washing machine. And we'll use it typically until it breaks. Now, when a washing machine breaks, it usually breaks after about 2,000 cycles. And if you were to call up the shop and say to them, hey, my washing machine's broken, it's typical that you get the response that it's cheaper to buy a new one than it is to repair the existing one. Or perhaps the cost of the labour is too high, or a part's been discontinued. That means that it simply makes more economic sense for you to buy a new one. That's a bit crazy if you think about it. And it didn't always used to be that way, of course. My parents had a washing machine that lasted them for about 30 years. Now, it wasn't that I was a smelly child. It was simply that we used to make things in that way. And we still could if we wished, but we choose not to. Because from the manufacturer's perspective, of course, why would they want to get rid of a customer and never see that customer again for 30 years? So you could say it makes business sense for them to be making things in that manner. And we call that planned obsolescence. And that's a central part of this industrial system of production. So we throw away the old washing machine, we go off and we buy a new one. The whole system kicks into operation once more. We call this the linear economy, and we think it's exemplified by the three words: take, make, and dispose. So we take natural resources out of the ground, we turn them into clever products, customer uses them and then throws them away, and ultimately it's a wasteful system. We call it the linear economy because the flow of energy and materials goes simply in one direction. It's a very fast system, it's a very efficient system. It produces a high volume of goods at high speed, and it depends on us consuming and buying a lot of stuff to keep it working, to keep oiling the wheels of it. And it's also a mindset. It's a mindset that prevails in our society. Our education system could be described as linear. Our farming system certainly could be described as linear. If you look at the farming system, which has been very successful in feeding a massively expanding population, especially since the Second World War, it's one of these systems that's in place to produce a hell of a lot of food in a short space of time and keep doing it. And as I say, it's worked well, but there has been many people holding up their hands for a while now saying, it's a flawed system, it's got problems. Agriculture alone, some of the problems that they face is a reduction in soil fertility, or a reduction in the levels of the nutritional value of food, or animal welfare is being harmed. So that's the linear economy for you. It's around us, it works very well, and it's worked very well for a lot of people for a long time. Many people have profited enormously from the linear economy, and it's true to say that the general standard of living around the world has increased. Not in all corners of the world, but some would say that we're getting there. However, the long-term viability of this model has been questioned. There are new models in place, and I'm obviously going to talk about one of those new models and show how perhaps it can become more lucrative. So where are the problems perhaps with the linear economy? Well, it depends on four key elements. 4 key elements to make sure it keeps working. And here they will be slowly appearing, I think. cheap labour, cheap energy, cheap materials, and plentiful credit. And as we look at these in turn, we can see that there are problems coming around with them. So plentiful credit, let's look at that. We know that we're in the midst of a credit crunch at the moment, and we just need to look at our high streets or go to our local shopping centres to see the effect that that has. Shops are closing down, businesses are closing down, and that means employment is reducing. And when employment reduces, that means people's spending power reduces. And that means the wheels of the linear economy are not being as well oiled as perhaps they were before. In fact, we know that manufacturers are producing far too much stuff for us here in the West. There simply isn't a market for all of it just now. In terms of employment, well, that's a problem too. I talked about the transfer of manufacturing jobs to places like China. Well, that's left a hole here in places like the UK, where we used to produce a lot of stuff. But also, we've got falling employment due to the credit crisis. In fact, in places like Spain and in Greece, there's 50% of young people are unemployed right now, 50%. And here in Scotland, we're finding that more and more young people are staying on at school because there's less for them to go to afterwards. So it's problematic. What about the other two, energy and materials? Well, if you look at your energy bills over the last few years, you'll find that your gas and electricity bills have been rising, and they've been rising pretty high. And you find you can do the same experiment if you go to the petrol pump. So that's problematic too. And also, I don't know how many gallons of oil are left in the ground, but what I do know is that the oil companies are finding riskier and riskier ways of extracting it, the Gulf of Mexico, for example. And I think that tells us something. Materials-wise, well, we've got a problem there too. Over the last 100 years, throughout the 20th century, the price of materials fell consistently for 100 years. And then in 2001, there was a turnaround. In 10 years, the rise in the cost of materials wiped out a century's decline. In just 10 years. And that's a lot for any business to swallow. The price of copper rose 10 times. The price of gold rose 6 times, lead 5 times. I could go on. And the reason why these materials are going up in price is because they're finite materials. And known stocks of them don't make for very good reading. To put a business case on the front of those prices, let me tell you that last year, your average EU car manufacturer spent 500 million euros more in raw materials than they did the year prior to that. And of course, they've got those rising energy costs too. They recognize that their business model isn't going to work for them long term. So they're looking for new models that could support them to survive and to thrive. So, typical approaches to dealing with these problems don't quite stack up. And that's why I've titled this talk, Rethink the Future. When I tell people about the materials crisis, you hear the same sort of answers. People say, well, we'll just use less, or we'll have a back to basics approach. Well, it doesn't really stack up, because we're talking about finite resources, aren't we? Using less of them doesn't make them last forever. We need to find a way of using materials without using them up. Or people say, well, why don't we recycle then? Okay, we can recycle, and there's been some success in terms of the quantity of stuff people are recycling. But typically, when we recycle, we downgrade the quality of the material, which means it's not as useful as it was before. I'm sure you've heard the term downcycling before. So we need something else. We need a different model that allows us to use things without using them up. A different model which grows employment, a model which reduces energy demand and everything that goes with that, and which enables businesses to be profitable. And also, on top of that, we need a new model which enriches our biosphere. So it doesn't just harm it, but helps improve it. So that's where the circular economy comes in. The circular economy is about asking designers, when they sit down to design their product, to ask themselves that question, how can this product be made to be made again? And when they start to do that, when they design for disassembly, an interesting thing happens. We start to see the whole system of how that operates does expand employment. It does reduce that energy demand, and it does mean that businesses can be more profitable. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. There's the car manufacturer who've taken in all their old parts of their cars into a remanufacturing plant in France. And what they're doing there is they're cleaning up all those parts, they're refurbishing them, they're fine-tuning them, and then they're selling those refurbished parts with an as-new warranty. And they're finding that customers can buy those for half the cost of new parts. Yet at the same time, the company is making a third more profit. A real win-win scenario. Or there's the computer company who's making computers for simple upgrade and repair. If you have ever been inside your computer, your desktop computer, you find it's a mishmash of wires and cables. Some people enjoy that, but this is a simple system I'm talking about. Push this button, take out the graphics processor, pop in the next one. They're doing this because they know they've got a customer for a very long time who's going to upgrade their machine as the years go by. Makes perfect business sense. Or carpets. Who would have thought carpets were interesting? I never did before, but there's a really interesting company in the Netherlands called Deso, and they make carpets that are made to be made again. That is, they get them back from their customers, and they put them through their clever machines. And that way, the old carpet becomes the new carpet. And they're doing this, powering the whole system with renewable energy, or at least they're hoping to move in that direction. They're getting close. Now, they worked out that people actually don't want to own their carpets. I mean, why do we want to own this? We don't want to own it. We want the service that it provides. I mean, we want the nice material underneath our feet or something that matches our color scheme. But ownership actually comes with a lot of problems. And their customers have found that actually it works out better for them to be hiring it from Deso rather than owning it. And from the company's perspective, they can see exactly where the raw materials are and exactly where their customers are. They've got a business model that works for them for the very long term. Okay, so what about the washing machine? Whoops, we're coming to that. I forgot I had slides to show you. So what about the washing machine example? Let's go back to that. So let's say instead of owning it, we leased it from the manufacturer. And if we leased it from the manufacturer, then they've got a vested interest in making sure that that machine works for us for the long run, which means they'll build it for a simple upgrade and for repair. So they could upgrade the software, for example, because it's the software that changes typically within these washing machines. And typically, what we've seen in trials where this has been done, customers are leasing it on a per wash basis, and customers are winning from this because they're getting a higher spec machine on a cheaper cost per wash. And of course, they're spreading their payments out instead of one big lump sum. And we're also seeing that the manufacturers are winning because they're getting multiple revenue streams from one machine, whereas previously, of course, they only had one revenue stream from that machine. And on top of that, they're saving massively in energy costs because 3/4 of the energy use in our industrial system come at the extraction of raw materials and the production from raw materials stages. So they're out of that game. They've bought their raw materials at yesterday's price. And what we see too for companies who are operating a circular economy business model is that employment rises, regional employment rises. Think of all the different jobs that are involved. There's customer liaison, there's collection, there's repair, there's remanufacturing. And we're seeing companies who are operating this model are opening up all sorts of places, like the car manufacturer I told you, where people are winning on a regional basis. And of course, that can replicate itself across the world. So one company that I know of who does this with printers has a remanufacturing plant in Coventry. Instead of sending their stuff back to China where it was assembled, they keep it here in the UK. And that's obviously good news for us as we look to the future. So we say it's time to ask some questions. It's time to rethink the future. It's time to ask ourselves, what do we want? Do we want a washing machine or do we want clean clothes? Do we need to own a building or is it great spaces that we really want? Can we use things without using them up? The Ellen MacArthur Foundation works with business because we want them to understand the profitable implications of switching to this business model and this design mindset. But we also work with universities and we work with schools because we recognize that the next bunch of designers, of entrepreneurs, of manufacturers, of business leaders, they're in our universities, they're in our schools, and we need them to start thinking differently about products, to start giving them a second life, to start to rethink the future. Thank you very much.